Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000 in Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today, we'll be talking about how to use vertical navigation for both VFR and IFR flying. And so you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to us now, just take a moment and touch the subscribe or the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. 2 weeks ago in episode 253, we talked with Seth Lake about the ICAO equipment codes needed to file an FAA flight plan. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/253. And this is a listener-supported show supported by you. So if you're enjoying this show, please help us out by signing up to become a member and support the show financially by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And you can read on our website there about the goodies you'll get. And of course, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, a B-17 and King Cobra collided at a Dallas air show. An attempted kidnapping of air traffic controllers in Haiti goes awry. And an embarrassing mistake was made on a new aviation stamp. All this and more. And the news starts now. From avweb.com, B-17 and King Cobra collide at Dallas Air Show. 6 people are dead after the mid-air collision of a B-17 and a P-63 King Cobra at the Wings Over Dallas Air Show put on by the Commemorative Air Force. The smaller plane disintegrated on contact with a 4-engine bomber, which split into 2 pieces and tumbled to the ground. Both aircraft are registered to American Air Power Heritage Museum, operated by the CAF in Dallas. The King Cobra is a larger and more powerful version of the P-36 Air Cobra. It was used almost exclusively in Russia, and this particular one was built in 1946. And if you've seen the video, it appears that the King Cobra was flying at a much higher speed than the P-51s. And of course, at a higher speed, you get a larger turn radius, which may be one possible reason for why this aircraft appeared to fly outside the track that it should have flown and ended up colliding with the B-17. From yahoo.com, plane hits radio antenna at air show. Planes were performing at a festival in Bragado City, Buenos Aires, Argentina, when one plane cut it a little too close. A video has been released showing the shocking moment when an airplane hit a radio tower. The video shows multiple planes performing stunts for a crowd of spectators at the festival before panning to an airplane that was flying from behind, which ultimately hit the tower. The tower can be seen in the video breaking and appearing to fall as the plane wing appears to be damaged as well. The unexpected hit caused the DHC-1 Chipmunk airplane to make an emergency landing. The pilot survived uninjured. Some spectators, on the other hand, did take a hit. 4 spectators on the ground were wounded by falling debris. 2 of the injured spectators were treated at the scene and others were taken to the hospital. The Transportation Safety Board of Argentina's Ministry of Transport is investigating the accident. From GeneralAviationNews.com, SR-22 crashes after student and CFI fight over the controls, and this comes from an NTSB report. It says, the flight instructor reported that he and the student pilot were landing at their home airport in Denver following a training flight in the Cirrus SR20. During the planned fuel stop landing with a gusting crosswind, the student pilot flared high and the plane drifted left of the center line. The flight instructor called for a go-around and attempted to take control of the airplane, but the student pilot did not understand the flight instructor's verbal commands, resulting in the 2 pilots fighting over the flight controls. The airplane subsequently hit terrain to the left of the runway and then slid across a taxiway, coming to rest between the taxiway and the parking apron. The airplane's left wing and firewall sustained substantial damage. The FAA inspector who examined the airplane reported that there were no pre-accident mechanical failures or malfunctions with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. At the time of the accident, the student pilot was landing the airplane on runway 17 left with winds of 230 at 10 to 15 knots. And the NTSB's probable cause states the student pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during landing with a gusting crosswind and his failure to go around and relinquish control of the airplane when directed by the instructor pilot. From avweb.com, researchers test sleep apnea device to prevent hypoxia. A warbird pilot is behind an experiment to see if a device normally used to enhance sleep can also keep pilots more alert while flying. Doug Rosendahl, who was working with doctors and researchers at Mercy One North Iowa Medical Center and the Mayo Clinic to see if use of a bilevel positive airway pressure machine will boost blood oxygenation and lessen the chance for hypoxia for those flying near 12,500 feet. BiPAPs create positive pressure in the lungs to reduce sleep apnea, Rosendale said. Actually, this was my idea to try this to see if BiPAP could increase oxygenization at altitude because I fly a lot. Using oxygen is a pain because your tank is always empty. Rosendahl said he normally flies his Baron at 8,000 feet to be on the safe side, but if the BiPAP can increase oxygenization, he'd rather be higher. Quote, if I can fly at 12,000 feet, that would allow me to get above weather, get better winds and fuel economy. It just allows for a lot more flexibility, he said. Last week he took off with 3 passengers, 2 of whom were masked up with portable BiPAPs. The third was a researcher who tested their cognitive and physiological response to being at 8,000 feet and 12,000 feet with a mask on. The results will be compared with baseline data obtained from the test subjects on the ground. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a near miss and a mishap with an iPad creates problem for Baron pilot. This comes from an ASRS NASA report written by the pilot. He writes, before I left for this trip, I restudied all the pertinent information and watched all YouTube videos I could find pertaining to Airport ZZZ. Approximately 12 miles from final, I was requested to slow to approach speed, which I did. I was then instructed by a tower to plan for runway X. I slowed and kept it at approach speed with a tailwind as I descended to 1,500 feet for final. With gear down and full flaps as I approached into a landing flare, tower instructed me to go around at approximately 50 feet above the ground in the Baron BE-58 and to fly straight ahead on runway heading due to conflicting traffic on an intersecting runway. I saw a very large Gulfstream immediately in my left front windshield and just barely below me. It was a very close encounter due to the controller. On the go-around climb-out, the mountain iPad weighing 3.5 pounds fell from its upper pilot side window mount, hitting me in the side of my head and mouth, breaking the noise-canceling headset microphone. It knocked the mic arm off the headset as well as knocking the headset off my head. The mountain iPad then fell to the right floor of the co-pilot side. My first concern was the iPad getting in the rudder pedals. After looking to the left and right and at a safe altitude, I reached down to pick up the iPad from the floor and apparently veered approximately 10 to 15 degrees to the right of course. At this point, I didn't have my headset on correctly, and I could hear the tower yelling at me something with the headset below my ears. I was concentrating on flying the airplane in engine management power settings and altitude. I was at approximately 1,700 feet or a little above. It was loud in the cockpit without the headphones on and the engines at takeoff power. The only way I could communicate was to hold the headset mic arm under my chin to try to talk. I tried to get one earpiece on and tried my best to communicate with the tower, and the wires keep it from holding under my chin and putting an earpiece on. I believe the tower controller was upset because he caused a missed and a go-around causing a conflict and starts yelling at me as to why I'm off my heading course within 7 seconds of the go-around and directs me to immediately leave his Class D airspace. I struggled to reply and sounded like I have something in my mouth with a broken mic. I request clearance to land and he refuses, yelling to leave his airspace immediately. I circled hoping I was outside of the Class D, but not knowing where I actually was because the iPad had lost its page. I was finally able to contact the correct approach. With his help, the tower gives me clearance to land on runway ZZ. As I exited the runway, the same tower operator got on frequency and started yelling again, stating there must be something wrong with me. I can't reply with my mic situation and don't try. Tower guy sends the authorities, airport security, and airport ops to see if I've been drinking or if there was something wrong with me. He wanted me in jail. I complied with all of security and tests for drugs and drinking. My wife and I were held at the plane for over an hour before we could go to the bathroom or get anything to drink. Airport security tried every trick in the book to trick me into confessing to anything. And in his concluding notes, he writes, forget the iPad if it drops and ask for help if you're able. Figure a better mounting than what they sell. I really wasn't able and should have squawked 7600 and been done with it. And from AINonline.com, this comes from an NTSB report, icing reported in area of fatal King Air crash. Moderate icing pileups and air mitts were being broadcast throughout the area where a Beechcraft E-90 King Air crashed on October 18th, according to a newly released NTSB preliminary report. The turboprop twin was on the RNAV runway 21 approach to Mid-Ohio Valley Regional Airport in Parkersburg, West Virginia, when it crashed, killing the 2 pilots. Satellite weather data at the time of the accident showed supercooled liquid water clouds from 1,300 feet to about 8,000 feet AGL in the area. Airport weather was reported as 1,400 feet overcast, light winds, 10-mile visibility, and a temperature of 3 degrees C. The aircraft was on a Part 91 positioning flight from John Glenn Columbus International Airport. On a 3-mile final, controllers cleared the aircraft to land, which was acknowledged by the pilots. There were no further communications from the flight crew. Eyewitnesses reported the airplane as flying straight and level before suddenly beginning a steep descent and spinning nearly vertically to the ground. Security camera footage showed the airplane's descent through impact and was consistent with eyewitness reports. The plane crashed into a car dealership parking lot and burned. Investigators were able to determine that the engines were likely operating when it crashed. The extent of damage, however, prevented determining if the anti-icing system was operating or in what position the system switches were. From dailypress.com, flight simulations raise money for charity. In the cockpit of a Boeing 737-800NG, the crew was going through flight preparations with all the lights burning and all the switches in the right places. But there was a distinct difference. All the activity took place in the basement of Fred Kurzowitz's home. There, a group of men worked with their full-scale cockpit simulator to raise money for charity. Kurzowitz and a team of 7 other flight simulator hobbyists participated in World Flight Simulation Program. The week-long program featured 45 different flight segments around the world, with the World Flight Team Virginia, the local team, flying 28 of the flights. Kurzowitz explained, World Flight was conceived back in 2001 to be a vehicle for the flight simulation community to raise money for various local charities. This is the second year we've participated, and the second year we've raised money for the Williamsburg Aviation Scholarship Program. This year, 10 teams participated in World Flight with their own cockpit simulators and crews. 2 are located in the U.S., with the remainder around the world. To learn more about World Flight Virginia team and to contribute money to its fundraising efforts, visit worldflightvirginia.net. And we have 2 stories from the Caribbean island of Hispaniola. This first comes from thespec.com, Canadian airline crew to be freed 7 months after arrest in Dominican Republic. A Canadian airline crew forced to stay in the Dominican Republic for 7 months after reporting a cache of drugs aboard their aircraft is finally on the verge of coming home. The 5-member Pivot Airlines crew were arrested April 5th after a flight technician alerted Punta Cana authorities to what turned out to be 210 kilos of cocaine stashed inside their Toronto-bound chartered plane. Local authorities have filed paperwork in a Punta Cana court to release the crew after spending 220 days in jail under house arrest, said Pivot Airlines CEO Eric Edmondson. Edmonds had said the paperwork is still pending final court sign-off, but begins a process that will grant the crew the necessary approvals to fly home. But given the considerable unforeseen delays the case has previously faced, Edmondson added there is not yet a timeline for the workers' return. He urged the Dominican Republic authorities to work quickly on the matter. Following the contraband discovery, the crew members, 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, and a part-time maintenance engineer, were held in jail for several days and then released on bail after surrendering their passports pending further investigation. They were never charged or questioned by police, according to Pivot. Edmondson said the crew members will be returning as heroes upon their arrival back in Canada. And from the other side of the island, this comes from aviationpros.com, attempted kidnapping of air traffic controllers in Haiti puts safety of airspace at risk. The recent attempted kidnapping of 3 ATC controllers near the international airport in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, is raising concerns about the safety of the Caribbean country's airspace. The International Federation of Air Traffic Controllers Association, in a statement posted to its website, said it's gravely concerned following the armed attack, which took place near the Toussaint Louverture International Airport of the capital while the employees were being transported to work. Following the incident, which left 1 air traffic controller with a gunshot wound to the leg and in need of surgery, Haiti's National Office of Civil Aviation has been using unqualified and unlicensed individuals to control the country's skies, said Trish Gilbert, Executive VP of the Americas region of the Air Traffic Controllers Association. Gilbert said, I get that they don't know what to do to keep their air traffic controllers safe, but we don't believe the answer is to just find people who have just never been air traffic controllers or who were air traffic controllers 10 years ago and plug them in and have them move airplanes. There has to be a better plan than that. The safety of Haiti's airspace is the latest in a list of issues being raised about the country, which is undergoing one of its worst humanitarian, security, economic, and political crises in decades. Since last month, a gang blockade of the country's main fuel terminal and seaports has created shortage of fuel, food, and water amid an outbreak in cholera and ongoing kidnappings. The Air Traffic Controllers Group said that while it acknowledges the ongoing difficulties in Haiti, More must be done to protect civil aviation workers. From Stripes.com, former Army pilot sentenced to prison after spying for China. A retired Army pilot who sold sensitive aviation-related information to China has been sentenced to over a year and a half in prison, the Justice Department said. Shapur Moinian, 67, pleaded guilty in June to accepting tens of thousands of dollars from Beijing representatives in exchange for information related to assorted aircraft designed and manufactured in the U.S. He had faced over a decade in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. After retiring from the Army in 2000, Moinian worked for defense contractors privy to classified information and was involved with several projects used by the military and U.S. intelligence agencies, Justice Department officials said. A Chinese operative first contacted him several years ago. Most of the information and materials Moinian gave the Chinese was collected from open sources on the Internet, and only a small amount of it was older proprietary information from his former American employers, the San Diego Union Tribune reported, quoting the defense at sentencing. Moinian's sentencing comes on the heels of the arrest of another former American military officer, Daniel Edmund Dugan. He ran an aviation consultancy in China and was arrested in Australia last month. British and Australian governments have complained that Beijing is poaching retired pilots to train Chinese air forces. And finally, from globalnews.ca, Beaver aircraft stamp fails to take off with Canadian aviators. And my thanks to Isaac Alexander of Hype Aviation for sending me this story. The story says it was meant to honor the de Havilland Beaver, a Canadian aviation workhorse, but a small stamp is causing a big upheaval in Canadian aviation circles. Canada Post unveiled the new stamp to much acclaim on October 13th as part of its Canadians in Flight series, honoring the country's achievements in aviation. Victoria-based Viking Air owns the plans and tools used to build the Beaver, and crucially, spare parts. But sharp-eyed aviation historians noticed a flaw. The aircraft pictured on the stamp bears the markings November 995 Sierra Papa, an American registration owned by Sportsman Air Service based in Anchorage, Alaska. According to owner Joe Schuster, the plane originally came from Canada. It was picked up there as a wreck and refurbished in the 1990s. It still flies more than 500 hours a year, ferrying tourist hunters and outdoor enthusiasts to hard-to-reach destinations. It flies slow, rarely getting over 1,000 feet elevation, and carries a big payload. The Beaver was the first all-metal bush plane designed and built in Canada, with 1,692 of them manufactured between 1947 and 1968. It still holds the record as the best-selling Canadian aircraft. More than 700 are still flying. Somewhere along the line, the Canada Post dropped the ball by putting a U.S. registration on the aircraft, said Tim Cole, a Canadian aviator and author whose book Tight Floats and Tailwinds chronicles his life as a bush pilot and Transport Canada administrator. Stamp collector Brian Grant Duff, the owner of All Nations Stamps and Coin, calls the inclusion of an American aircraft a mistake. It's an amusing error, he said. Obviously, the aviation community is upset about this, and flying in planes is all about safety and attention to detail. So when something sloppy happens, the aviation community can get upset because they're all about safety and attention to detail. Canada Post said the stamp shows the Beaver's popularity beyond the country's borders, and no word on whether they plan to change the stamp. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then we'll talk about vertical navigation, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's start off with the good news department. First, congratulations to Chen Chen. He's a client of mine. He passed his private in an SR20 this past week. And also congratulations to Ray Lynn. She soloed in a 152 at West Valley in Palo Alto. A pretty funny story. I was standing outside the clubhouse talking with a client, and as she walked by, she stopped and she said, "Oh, are you Max Truscott?" So she listens to the podcast. We'd never met before, but she recognized my voice as she walked by. So pretty funny. Anyway, congratulations to both Chen Chen and to Ray Lynn. And here's an email from Ernie in Maine. I had probably half a dozen different folks write in about this. He says, "Hey Max, was just enjoying episode 252 when I heard you reading a listener mail suggesting that the Rotax 912 turns slower than the prop. You, Max, had it right originally." And I had talked about this, and a listener wrote in and said something which apparently most of you caught and said, "Nope, I shouldn't have read that correction because it was wrong." Anyway, Ernie says that the engine has a reduction gearbox to allow the propeller to turn slower than the engine. The 912 has a much smaller displacement than an equivalent horsepower traditional airplane engine. In order to produce more horsepower with less displacement, the engine must be operated at a higher RPM. And I mentioned during the show that it can be up around 5,000 RPM. Ernie says this results in more combustion cycles in a given amount of time, slowing it to make up for the smaller pistons and displacement. Propellers don't like spinning faster because, among other things, the tips may end up exceeding the speed of sound, which is noisy and I believe less efficient. The solution is gear reduction. So thanks, Ernie, and to everyone else who sent in a note to correct the correction. And our first news story today was about a mid-air collision. I just want to mention that there was a General Aviation mid-air collision risk report that was put out in February of 2022. I'll include a link to this report in the show notes. It says that from 2016 to 2021, there were 43 reports of mid-air collisions involving GA operations in the United States, resulting in 79 fatalities. And the report does a nice job of graphically showing on sectional charts where the most number of TCAS RA or resolution advisory events have occurred, and they use colors to show clusters of where these, near midair collisions, if you will, have occurred. So you might want to check out the report if you live in a metro area and just see where most of the RAs, the resolutionary advisory events, occur in your particular area. And here's an article that'll be of interest to folks that live down under. This comes from AustralianFlying.com. It says AOPA CEO forfeited salary under COVID. Now, this is talking about AOPA Australia CEO Ben Morgan. And by the way, we had interviewed Ben in episode 89 way back in December of 2018 when I visited Australia. Got a chance to meet with him. And the article says he didn't draw a salary temporarily during the pandemic. And it says that the AOPA president, Sean Kelly, said that this was just one of several measures that helped the organization survive the downturn caused by the pandemic, and that AOPA Australia is now in a position to start rebuilding. He says, during the height of the pandemic, we were cognizant of the financial challenges faced by many of our members. We had a significant number of members who had become suddenly unemployed and for whom even $159 Australian was a financial challenge. In recognition of this, we didn't push for renewals. We battened down the hatches and reduced our outlays to ensure we could remain solvent and able to serve our members. Falcon Air at Bankstown Airport stepped up and offered us free office space, for which we are exceptionally grateful. It says over the pandemic period, they stopped publishing their online publication. And they say as part of the program to help revitalize AOPA, the board appointed well-known aviation advocate Lorraine McGillivray as membership manager. In this role, she'll be assisting members join and renew membership, along with help reconnect the association through email updates, social media posts, and website articles. And they say the AOPA AGM held in September revealed that membership had more than halved since the last full pandemic year in 2019. So if you're down under, I would encourage you to go ahead and sign back up, help support the organization. Same here, by the way, for people here in the United States and other countries. If you are not currently a member of one of the large pilot associations such as AOPA and EAA, now is the time to join. And joining is not just about getting a magazine. It's really about helping to fund these aviation advocacy groups, which have full-time staff members working on lobbying Washington and state legislatures on important issues that affect aviation. So please support AOPA and sign up to become a member, both in Australia, the U.S., and around the world. And it's Cyber Monday as I record this. I hope you got whatever you were interested in purchasing on that day. Only thing I picked up was a GoPro mount from mypilotpro.com. And, of course, it wasn't on sale, but I did want to pick it up anyway. It's mounts to the tie-down ring on the wing of most aircraft. So I'm going to try shooting with my 360 camera on that on the upcoming trip that I have coming up this next weekend to Southern California. And speaking of Cyber Monday and fun purchases, just a quick reminder that Lightspeed has chosen to support the show by paying us a small referral fee anytime you buy a headset from them, if you start your visit to their website through one of the links either in our show notes or in the app that you might be listening to us. And you can find any of our show notes by going to aviationnewstalk.com. You'll find links to their 3 different headsets there. And if you make a purchase, that'll be another way that you can help support the show, for which I thank you. And here's an email from a CFI who wanted to remain anonymous. He said he didn't want this comment to reflect badly on his flight school. He said, I had 3 CO or carbon monoxide alarms last week in 2 different airplanes. I guess it's the season, he said. I wish more CFIs would understand the importance of having a monitor, be it a Sentry, a Lightspeed headset, a toxin portable unit, or something other type of monitor. He said each time it went off and we returned to the maintenance shop, they found the source. I don't mean this as a knock on maintenance. I feel they do a great job of keeping older planes that get a lot of training use and service and immediately ground them when issues like this come up. But what I find amazing is when the younger CFIs ask me what happened, and I tell them, some respond with, that's so weird. I just flew that plane and she flew fine. Really? I don't know how carbon monoxide affected how a plane flew. Well, I guess it does affect it if you become unconscious. So good alert there. Definitely, if you don't have a CO monitor, now might be a good time to go ahead and purchase one. And here's a service alert that a listener sent in for the Garmin GFC 500 autopilot. Now, that's an aftermarket autopilot for the most part. So in most cases, people have installed it to replace an older autopilot in an older aircraft, though I know that it does ship in a few new aircraft, such as the Flight Design F2. And basically, it says that it's for all certified GFC 500 autopilots with optional GSA 28 pitch trim servo. It says that it does not affect those that are installed in the Cirrus SR20 22 aircraft using STC, and it gives the number of that. And it says for experimental and light sport installations, refer to Garmin Service Bulletin 22.11.2. And the issue is an uncommanded automatic pitch trim runaway that may occur when the autopilot is first engaged. And it says engagement of the autopilot with this condition may result in an uncommanded deviation from the intended or desired flight path. Before further flight, one of the following must be completed: either disable the GFC autopilot by pulling the autopilot circuit breaker and placarding the autopilot inoperative, or contact a Garmin dealer to disable the pitch trim as directed in a Garmin STC Service Bulletin 22.110. And the good news is that this issue apparently will be corrected relatively quickly with a future software update that is expected in Q4 of 2022. And this past weekend, we had the second deployment of the parachute on an SF-50 Vision jet. This happened in Indiana. I'm looking at a story from Fox59.com, and they did update this story. The first version of it said that the pilot jumped out of the airplane with a parachute. They have since updated the story. It says small plane crash landed in a pond near Indianapolis Regional. According to Indiana State Police, it happened about 8 a.m. on the property of a Carvana used car dealer. No one was injured. And they said the pilot, a 54-year-old from Palm Bay, Florida, told authorities they had taken off from the Indianapolis Regional in the Cirrus SF-50 and were on the way to Florida. He says as he tried to gain altitude, the jet began to sputter and stall. When the aircraft went nose up and lost power, the pilot said he activated the emergency system that deployed a parachute. The parachute allowed the jet to slowly glide down to Earth with the pilot safely inside. And, of course, it says the FAA and NTSB will be investigating. And I took a look at the ground track on it. This aircraft was not in the air for very long. It reached about 1,000 feet above the ground. The typical minimum altitude for pulling the parachute is 600 feet. So very lucky for them that they were above that minimum altitude. And, of course, they walked away from that, which is what the parachute is intended to do. So congratulations to Cirrus and the pilot for a successful outcome. And I had a somewhat related email that came in a few weeks ago from Jerry in Texas. He said, "Hello, Max. This morning, one of my Facebook pages had a video of a Cirrus," this was probably an SR-22, descending under its cap's parachute canopy, landing in a parking lot, and the pilot getting out of the airplane. Next came all the usual trolls, scams, misinformation, lies, and BS, including a few real good questions. One contributor stated flatly that once they use the caps, the plane is totaled. Another contributor responded that 30 of them have been saved and returned to service so far. So, 1, what's the fate of the plane after CAPS deployment? And 2, is there data on the cost to recommission the airplane? Jerry, thanks so much for your email. Yes, I don't know the exact number, but the person who mentioned 30 have been returned to service is correct. I think that the number is around 15%. which probably translates to a little bit fewer than 30, but that's in the ballpark. And that's kind of interesting because when the aircraft was designed, it was originally believed that none of these aircraft would ever return to service. But in fact, some of them have been repairable, or I should say economically repairable. You could probably repair any of them. But the question is, would it be cost effective to do that? And two, is there data on the cost to recommission the airplane? Boy, I have to imagine that varies widely. I haven't seen a number, but I can imagine it's probably a minimum of $100,000 to get an airplane that's pulled caps back into service. Thanks for your question there, Jerry. And speaking of Facebook trolls and things like that, here's an email from patron supporter Christopher Brown. He writes, "Hello, Max. Love the show and happy to be able to support it. I did want to bounce a question off you, and perhaps it could be shareable. I recently had an experience that I thought was kind of cool. I'm flying a brand new 2022 SR20. I was planning to head home to KDXR, which I think is Danbury, Connecticut, from KUNV, which is Penn State College, Pennsylvania, on a Tuesday after spending Monday night and participating in a recruiting event at Penn State. As I checked the weather, it was not only IMC, but windy beyond my comfort level, with gusts at my destination upwards of 25 to 30 knots. So I called up the hotel and reserved the room for one more night. The next morning, I checked the weather, and while there was quite a bit of rain, fog, and clouds the whole way home, wind was pretty calm and forecast to remain so. So I filed my flight plan, added an alternate, and headed off to the airport. Takeoff was smooth, and I was in the clouds at about 1,000 feet, popping out of the top at around 7,000, but cruising at 9,000 almost the whole way. As I neared the destination, I confirmed that I'd be using the RNAV approach to runway 8, loaded it, planned out the missed approach, and went through each checklist, got appropriate clearances, etc. I was in the soup again from about 6,000 feet on down. MDA is 1,180 feet, and as I crossed below 1,250 feet, I got ready to push the takeoff go-around or toga button and start climbing, only to have the clouds open up right at about 1,200 feet, with me staring at the front of the runway directly ahead, maybe 2 miles off and 700 feet down. It was almost too perfect, but I wasn't going to complain. I landed without incident. I figured, hey, this would be a kind of cool story to share in a Facebook group. While most of the comments are along the lines of, that's great, it's always awesome when that works out, I did receive one comment that made me wonder if I made some bad choices along the way. And the comment was, so you shot a non-precision approach in hard IFR crap weather? You might want to revisit that planning and keep working on your skills. Am I dealing with a simple troll here, or is he bringing up a good point? The whole thing went by the book. I had about 4 more hours of fuel on board and was perfectly ready to head elsewhere if need be. I'm also flying an advanced airplane with autopilot that can just about do the whole thing for me, though I'm ready to take over. What's your take? Don't feed the trolls, or should I be rethinking my planning decisions for future reference? Thanks again for everything you do. Well, Christopher, nice to hear from you again. By the way, I grew up about 2 hours northeast of State College, and the lady I took to the prom was a townie from State College. We had met at summer camp. Anyway, it's such a great town, but then I really like university towns in general. Anyway, it sounds to me like you did everything just right. The problem with many Facebook commenters is that they do zero research. They spend only a couple of seconds thinking about a post before they dash off whatever is on the top of their mind. I think if this person had done any research, he'd know that there are no precision approaches available into Danbury, probably because of all the hills around the airport. About the only thing I might have done differently is fly the localizer runway 8, since it has minimums that are 80 feet lower, though in general I strongly prefer RNAV approaches and might not have chosen the localizer when the minimums were so close to each other. Frankly, I think you did just fine. So thanks for sharing your story and for supporting the show. And, the other thing I've got to say about Facebook, I'm always amazed that people go to Facebook groups to get information, because when they ask a question, they'll get usually 80 responses, and somewhere buried in those 80 may be the right answer, but how the heck do you know? And here's a quick update about what I've been up to. I've had a busy couple of weeks teaching and traveling. Typically, I take off Saturday every week as well as half a day on Sunday, but I have flown the past 2 weekends. So that means I've flown every day for about 2.5 weeks and finally got a day off when some aircraft went down for maintenance, and also had some time off at Thanksgiving. Now, the first weekend trip was to Knoxville to pick up a new SF-50 Vision jet and fly back to California with its owner. I've mentioned in the past how I'm often delayed on connecting flights to Knoxville, so this was the second time I instead took a direct flight to Nashville and drove to Knoxville. I also went out a day early so that I'd be well rested, and I took an indirect route to Nashville and visited with Catherine Cavagnaro, who we've had on the show numerous times in the past. We had fun hanging out at a coffee shop and made some plans for some future episodes. I talked briefly with the Vision Jet owner about leaving toward the end of that free day, but Hurricane Nicole by then was a tropical storm, was passing to the east of Knoxville and was throwing out lots of low clouds and ice, so I suggested that we stick to our original plan and leave the following day, Saturday. The weather then was predicted to be 700 overcast, but it turned out to be much better, with broken clouds around 5,500 feet that morning. The trip back to California was uneventful, other than headwinds, which varied from about 70 to 100 knots. So other than that, the weather was perfect with no turbulence, and we barely passed through a cloud except briefly while departing Knoxville. And a week later, also on Saturday, I flew again with a Vision Jet owner as we did 2 runs to Truckee and back, shuttling his family and friends who spent the Thanksgiving week there. Temperatures were cool around freezing. There was plenty of snow on the ground, and some of the ski areas were already open. And again, there was hardly a cloud in the sky as there was a strong region of high pressure dominating the area. The following day, Sunday, I left on a 2-day trip with a client who owns a Turbo 206 and who needs to build some additional time for insurance purposes. Now, this is the same aircraft I told you about in September, which left us stranded overnight in Daggett, California, when the battery died after we landed there to refuel. Our plan for this trip was to do a large circle, stopping at a number of airports in California, Nevada, and Utah. This time, we also had a few small misadventures with the aircraft, even though it's a 2019 model with fewer than 200 hours on it. The first was that we discovered that the 2 rear doors on the right side of the aircraft hadn't been closed properly and were now stuck together in a way that wouldn't really allow either of them to open. The rear door has a latch on the bottom, and that door hadn't been closed far enough for the latch to engage. And when the more forward door was closed, the bottom of that door became trapped behind the rear door. Now, we did a lot of prying and pulling while attempting to not damage the paint where the 2 doors meet. Eventually, as I was pulling on the forward door, it suddenly came loose and smacked me in the forehead. Now, luckily, it surprised me more than it hurt me, though later I discovered that I'd cut one of my fingers, so I spent some time visiting 3 different places at the airport before coming up with a Band-Aid. When we were fully loaded and ready to go, we were chagrined to find that the airplane would not start. And we tried a number of times until I could tell that the battery was starting to run down. At that point, we contacted the club's maintenance person, Jaden, who I believe listens to the show, and he helped us push the plane over to the maintenance hangar where we could attach it to an external power source. Even after connecting the external power source, we still couldn't get it started, but there were 2 clues that helped. There was a puddle of gas beneath the plane where it was originally parked, which led us to believe that we'd been over-priming the aircraft. Also, it was a cold day, and on cold days, it's recommended that after you prime an aircraft that you don't start it immediately, as in cold weather, it takes longer for the fuel to atomize, and it's the fuel's vapors that ignite, not the liquid, so you need to wait longer for those vapors to form. We let the aircraft sit for a while, and then we were able to get it started. One thing we noticed is that when it's cold, this aircraft doesn't like having the mixture pushed in all the way after engine start, as that was killing the engine. So instead, we pushed the mixture control in only about halfway during subsequent engine starts during our 2 days of flying. The engine issue delayed us more than an hour, but we finally got on our way. Our first stop was Truckee, where I'd been in the Vision Jet twice the day before. It is a great airport with a nice place to get lunch inside, though we had brought our lunch with us. We then took off and did a touch and go at the Reno, Nevada airport. From there, we flew south along the eastern side of the snow-covered Sierras, which were absolutely beautiful. That's where I started my video cameras, and I'll be sharing that footage with members who support the show via Patreon. We then crossed over the mountains at a low point and flew over Lake Tahoe en route to the South Lake Tahoe Airport, which has an elevation of about 6,300 feet and has an 8,500-foot-long runway. The winds were calm, so we landed on runway 18, rolled out to the very end, got set up for our next leg to the Lee Vining Airport near Mono Lake, and took off on runway 36, which took us back out over the lake. We climbed up over the lake and then headed southeast at 13,500 feet. Now, this was the first time the owner had tried out the aircraft's built-in oxygen, so we strapped on our mask during the climb. And since we were running late, I suggested we skip Lee Vining Airport and we continue to Mammoth Lakes KMMH. Now, I've talked in the past about how the Oceano Airport is my favorite airport in California, And it's been a while since I was at Mammoth, and this time I realized it's probably my second favorite airport. And if you haven't been there, I'd strongly urge you to visit sometime, preferably when the weather is clear and when there's snow on the mountains, because it's just beautiful. Several years ago, I took one of my all-time favorite photos while I was there, and it's the photo you see at the top of my aviationnewstalk.com website. It shows the V-tail of a Vision jet parked at Mammoth, lined up perfectly with a V-shaped portion of the snow-covered Sierra Mountains. It's a great photo, and I really love it. We refueled and then left for the Canyonlands Airport at Moab, Utah. Now, Moab is located between the Arches National Park and the Canyonlands National Park. It's a small town of about 5,000 people, but it's a big tourist destination for people who want to view and hike among the red rocks surrounding the area. Since we had a delayed start, we arrived after dark and flew the RNAV GPS-3 into the runway just to make sure we'd stay clear of terrain. After we landed, we spent about an hour trying to get a ride. The hotel had given us a list of numbers to call, none of which were productive. We tried Uber and Lyft, but apparently they have few drivers in that area and none were signed on. I finally found a reference to Moab Taxi, and we spoke to the owner, Cliff. Since the airport is about 20 miles south of town, it took him about 25 minutes to get to us. The next morning, Cliff picked us up at the hotel and took us back to the airport. Now, it had been cold overnight, and the plane was now covered with frost. And when I turned on the G1000, the oil temperature was just 26 degrees. Now, starting an engine when it's that cold can eventually cause engine wear, so we had the plane towed to an electrical outlet where we plugged in the airplane's engine oil heater. Now, that's an electrical plug near the oil dipstick. I've used one once before when bringing a new SR22T across the country, and that time it took an hour to get the temperature to change, maybe 5 to 7 degrees. This heater worked much faster, and we got it up to 45 degrees in about 45 minutes. During that time, we got the aircraft refueled and watched the sun melt the frost from the wings and the windshield. And at one point, we turned the airplane away from the sun just to get more sun on the backside of the wings to speed up the frost removal. Well, on the way back, we stopped again at Mammoth Lakes to refuel, but after taking off for the last leg to Palo Alto, we had an alternator failure. Now, we ran the checklist, but we could not get the alternator back online. So to preserve the battery, we shut it off so that we could use the radio and flaps at our destination. That meant that we had to use our iPads and ForeFlight for navigation across the Sierra Mountains, which worked out fine. And when we got within about 30 miles of Palo Alto, we turned the battery back on, picked up flight following since we were entering a pretty busy area, and the rest of that flight was uneventful. The flaps worked as expected when we landed, and we were back well before dark. All in all, a fun trip, and I did shoot lots of great video, and I'll be sharing that in the near future with members of the podcast who are signed up on Patreon at the $20 a month level or higher. And here's a brief message from new Patreon supporter J.D. Goldstein. He says, I've been a fan for over a decade when I started listening to you on the Airplane Geeks podcast, which is the other show that I co-host. He says, I've listened to every episode of Aviation News Talk. Thanks for all you do for GA. And I got to say, I'm always amazed every time someone contacts me and says that they've listened to every episode, because we're now up to, 254 episodes. We may have to start a club. I don't know what we would call it or what we would offer, but if you have any suggestions, please let me know. And let's see if you know any of these people who've just signed up over the last 2.5 weeks to help support the show via Patreon. These people have all signed up at the $8 a month level. They include Ryan Eberhardt, Jim Fall, Brian Schiff, Brian Drennan, J.D. Goldstein, Michael Gadbois, Tom Quinby, and Maurice Gunderson. And at the $20 a month level, let's welcome Jerry, Pat Bellinger, Nicholas Rial, Jim Samuels, and Bob Goulet. And we had a one-time donation via PayPal from Aaron C. for $8. And if you'd like to become a member of the club to help support this show, easy to do. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can sign up via Patreon and sign up at various dollar levels per month. And you'll also read about the goodies that you'll get. Or you can make a one-time donation or a monthly donation via PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're talking all about vertical navigation, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about vertical navigation. We'll talk about it both in its simplest forms that any VFR pilot might use and in more complicated versions for IFR pilots. Now, back in episode 249, I talked about an issue I ran into when flying a Vision jet to Bakersfield, California, in which we were given a descent at pilot discretion and didn't descend immediately to save fuel since jet engines burn more fuel at lower altitudes. And the reason we stayed high is because we were looking at the TOD, or top of descent waypoint in front of us, which suggested we didn't need to start descending for a while. But what I didn't realize was that our TOD waypoint was very misleading, as it was calculated on a route that would first take us to the Bakersfield airport, then back in the direction we were coming from, to the IAF for the instrument approach we loaded. This added perhaps 10 extra miles that we weren't going to fly, and so it calculated a TOD point well beyond where we really needed to start coming down. When I finally realized our mistake, we had a hard time getting down because we'd stayed up too high for too long. Now here's some feedback from listener Ed Waters about that episode. Ed is a CSIP instructor who does a lot of contract work for Cirrus at Knoxville.
Hey, Max. Good morning. It's Ed. How you doing? Good to see you in Knoxville this week. Thanks for stopping by a couple times to chat. So I was rowing this morning to episode 249, which was excellent. And it's things that aren't discussed enough. And I just wanted to share a tip with you regarding that descent into Bakersfield. I've really studied VNAV over the years in all the different systems and learned its value. And the way I describe it is that pilots are pretty good with lateral situation awareness because, we walk down hallways, we go indoors, but vertically we're challenged because on the ground here, all we do is get on elevators, push a button, and we get off, So we fail to appreciate some of the altitudes involved. So what I do with that is, let's say we're taking off from Knoxville going somewhere. In the destination part of the flight plan, I have the pilot put in 1,000 feet and switch it to AGL, which Garmin will ask you, do you want to, convert that? And it turns out it's the pattern altitude of the airport. So as soon as you level off in a VFR or IFR flight, you immediately have an appropriate top of descent. And if you're on a VFR flight, then you can introduce a long track offset to that. You can show them how to use the VNAV function on the autopilot.
Now, vertical navigation is fairly simple if you're flying at just a few thousand feet in a slower aircraft. In my early days flying a Cessna 150 and later Cessna 172, I didn't give a lot of thought about it. When I saw my destination airport, I just pull the power back, lower the nose, and start heading down to traffic pattern altitude. And much of the time that works out just fine, though it sometimes leads to pilots arriving high in the traffic pattern, and that could lead to an unstable approach if you're descending on final at more than 1,000 feet per minute because you've had to pull the power to idle and begin a forward slip to get down onto the visual glide slope provided by the VASI or PAPI at the airport. And much of the time, pilots successfully land after these heroics to get down, but it may be a little unsettling to passengers who aren't accustomed to high descent rates and perhaps seeing the runway off to the side of the plane. Now, you may have heard that the best predictor for a good landing is a stabilized approach, and having sat in the right seat for 20 years watching people land, I can confirm that that's true. Now, you may still be able to get a good landing out of an unstable approach, but I almost always see great landings after stable approaches. In addition to helping with landings, good vertical navigation may also extend your engine life. Suppose you don't spot the airport until the last minute, you're too high, and you need to pull the power to idle for an extended time to get the aircraft down. During that time, the engine is cooling off because it's just gone from cruise power to idle. Now, this may not be as big an issue in an aircraft such as the Cessna 172, as these under 200 horsepower engines tend to have more metal per horsepower, so they don't cool off as rapidly as higher horsepower engines do, which have less metal per horsepower. For example, if you're flying an aircraft with a 310 horsepower engine, especially if it's turbocharged, you may eventually shorten the life of the engine if you fly at cruise power, stay at altitude until you spot the airport, and then pull the power to idle in the descent because you're too high to make a normal approach to the airport. So the bigger the engine and the higher you fly, the greater the need for good vertical navigation. Unfortunately, avionics manufacturers have come up with tools in their electronic GPS navigators to help you plan your vertical navigation in advance so you can avoid having to do a slam dunk approach. I first saw this capability in the Garmin 430, which was introduced 25 years ago in 1997. Now, Garmin has sold over 100,000 430s, and 530s. So there's a good chance you fly an aircraft with one. So if you're unfamiliar with how to use its vertical navigation function, now's a good time to commit to learning how to use it. And both my Max Trescott's Garmin G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook and my G3000 and G5000 Handbook have sections called Vertical Navigation, which talk in detail about how to use these functions in these Garmin glass cockpits. If you fly any of these glass cockpits and you're not an expert on vertical navigation, well, I recommend you buy one of the books, and you can find a link to where to buy them from me in the show notes. And of course, if you sign up to join the club and support Aviation News Talk at the $50 a month or higher level, I'll be sending you a signed copy of one of those books. Here's what my G1000 book says in part. Quote, vertical navigation, or VNav, is a function that calculates when to start descending at a specified vertical speed, so you'll arrive at a target altitude, perhaps the traffic pattern altitude if you wish, at some specified distance from a waypoint, such as your destination airport. The system makes these calculations and graphically shows where the descent begins and ends. In the original G1000 software, this function was on a dedicated third page in the FPL or flight plan group. In the Perspective and later G1000 software versions, vertical navigation is incorporated into the MFD's main flight plan page. So, in the G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, there is a vertical navigation function in the flight plan, and you can specify a different altitude for every waypoint in your flight plan. But there's also a very simple feature you can use for vertical navigation to a single waypoint, and frankly, that's all GA pilots need most of the time. You're not doing a series of step-downs at which you need to cross each waypoint at specific altitudes, unless, of course, you're flying an IFR arrival or an instrument approach. Instead, you just want to make sure you arrive at or near your destination at a specific altitude. This direct-to vertical navigation to a single waypoint is also the only form of vertical navigation found in the Garmin 430s and 530s, and it's very useful. Here are a few examples of how you can use it. Let's say you're flying to a non-towered airport, but you're coming from the opposite side of the airport from the traffic pattern, and you need to cross overhead the field. If the airport is at all busy, you may want to cross the field at 1,000 feet above the traffic pattern, fly out at least 2 or 3 miles, and then turn back to the airport to enter the 45 to join the traffic pattern. To make it simple, let's assume the field is at sea level and the traffic pattern is 1,000 feet MSL. So you want to be at 2,000 feet MSL as you cross overhead the field. Using the direct-to vertical navigation function, you would enter the airport identifier into the vertical navigation page, and you'd enter 2,000 feet MSL on the page. The navigator would then notify you when to start descending, so you'll cross over the airport at exactly 2,000 feet. And if you have an autopilot coupled to your navigator, in many cases the autopilot will fly the vertical descent for you and level off at 2,000 feet as you reach the airport. Now that's a fairly standard capability in any Garmin glass cockpit. Or suppose you're approaching this non-towered airport from the side of the airport with the traffic pattern, so you're able to fly directly to the 45 to enter the traffic pattern. Now the FAA wants us to be at traffic pattern altitude when we're on the 45, so you'd want to be at TPA about 3 miles from the airport. Now even a 25-year-old Garmin 430 will help you do that. On the vertical navigation page, you'd specify that you'd like to be at 1,000 feet, the traffic pattern altitude, when you're at a point that's 3 miles from the airport identifier. The navigator would then notify you when to start descending, so you'll be at exactly 1,000 feet when you're 3 miles from the airport. Now, vertical navigation can be extremely helpful when you're flying a long straight-in approach to an airport. Over the years, I've noticed many pilots screw up the long straight-in approach, even though it's seemingly the easiest possible way to land at an airport. And interestingly, I've never seen techniques for flying a long straight-in approach discussed in any training materials, other than that the pilot should remain at or above any visual glide slope indicator, such as a VASI or PAPI, or that they might want to back up a long straight-in approach with electronic guidance, such as from an ILS. For long straight-in approaches, I often see pilots fly at near cruise speed until they're perhaps 3 miles from the airport and on the visual glide slope. Then, when they add flaps, the aircraft almost always balloons up at least 100 feet, putting them above the glide slope. Or in some cases, before adding flaps, they've had to first level off and wait for the aircraft to slow down to the flap operating speed before they could add flaps. So while waiting to slow down, they went above the glide slope, and adding flaps sent them even further above the glide slope. Now here's what I tell pilots to do to avoid these problems. First, create a waypoint 3 miles from the runway that's 1,000 feet above the runway using the vertical navigation feature of your avionics. Why 1,000 feet? Because on a normal 3-degree glide slope, you'll drop about 320 feet per nautical mile. So at 3 miles out from the runway, you should be at around 960 feet or about 1,000 feet. If you're flying to a really long runway, you'll have to make some adjustments to this as the airport identifier is at the center of the airport. If you're landing on a 2-mile-long runway, that point's about a mile past the beginning of the runway. So in that case, you might create a 1,000-foot point that's not 3 miles, but 4 miles from the airport. When flying along straight in approach, just cross the 3-mile waypoint at 1,000 feet above the field elevation at a speed similar to what you'd be at on the downwind. That way you'll be slow enough to add flaps as you cross the waypoint, and you'll remain on the glide slope to the runway. Of course, please realize that in all of these cases, you need to be thinking about terrain. For example, if there's a 1,200-foot hill 3 miles from the airport, you don't want to be descending to 1,000 feet at that point as you'll crash into terrain. So with all vertical descent planning, you must think about terrain. And if it's at night and you can't see the terrain, then do whatever planning you need to avoid the terrain. Because vertical navigation can kill you, as in most cases, it knows nothing about terrain. It just assumes flat land all around the airport, which may not be the case for your destination airport. To create a point 3 miles from the airport in the Garmin navigators, you want to use the Along Track Offset soft key or button, which may be labeled ATK OFS. To use it, put the cursor in your flight plan on your destination airport, push the Along Track Offset soft key or button, enter -3 miles and press the Enter key, then enter the altitude for that waypoint. You can enter it as either an MSL or AGL altitude. So in this example, the easiest thing to do is to enter 1,000 feet and select AGL, which will then calculate an MSL altitude that's 1,000 feet above the airport elevation. After you create the waypoint, you'll see a TOD or top of descent point on the moving map. This is the point on your flight plan at which you should start your descent. And the descent rate is calculated based on a different default angle assigned for each aircraft type. In general, slower aircraft have steeper descent angles, maybe around 2.4 degrees, and faster aircraft have steeper descent angles, maybe around 1.7 degrees. Then based on your airspeed, the GPS navigator uses that descent angle to calculate a descent rate in feet per minute. Now, these always result in kind of goofy numbers, such as -641 feet per minute. So rather than descend at an angle, I prefer a descent rate that's a more rounded number. So I'll typically go into the flight plan and change the descent rate to something like -500 or -600 feet per minute. And when I do that, the location of the TOD and the time left to get there will change. In newer glass cockpit installations, you can then couple the autopilot to the vertical descent profile, so it will cross the designated waypoint at the altitude you've entered. On Garmin autopilots, you need to push the VNV key so the autopilot will command a descent starting at the calculated TOD waypoint. In addition, you'll also need to turn the altitude selector knob to a lower altitude. If you leave it at your current altitude, the autopilot will not descend when you reach the TOD waypoint. Older navigators, such as the Garmin 430 and 530, only let you perform vertical navigation to a single waypoint, which is fine if you only want navigation to one point near the airport, such as in the scenarios we've discussed. But in modern glass cockpits, such as the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, vertical navigation can also be used to follow a series of stair steps, such as those found in an instrument approach. Or, if you'd like, you could even create a flight plan with a series of waypoints that create a route and then assign different altitudes to each waypoint. You could then use the autopilot's VNV key to descend to each of these different altitudes in succession, though it can't automatically climb to higher altitudes, probably because of concern the aircraft might stall if the pilot didn't add power. For example, when I fly the RNAV GPS 31 approach into my home airport of Palo Alto, after I'm cleared for the approach, I press the autopilot's VNV and APR keys. The VNV key will track the initial stair steps at the beginning of the approach. Later, when the advisory glide path becomes active, the autopilot's approach mode will capture and track the GPS glide path. I also need to lower the selected altitude with the Alt Select knob, because if I leave it at my current altitude, the aircraft won't descend. Now let's talk about the problem I encountered at Bakersfield, where my TOD was calculated based on a route that went first to the airport and then back in the direction I was flying from before returning to the airport again. That can occur in some GPS navigators, especially if you've loaded the approach with an IAF versus loading it with vectors. Suppose I'm in the situation I described in episode 249, where my TOD became inaccurate after I added instrument approach. First, here's what listener Chuck Price wrote in a recent email. He said, "Was just listening to episode 249. I thought I'd share my technique for TOD calculation, which works well for me, at least for longer IFR flights in my TBM. Once I level off at my final altitude and cruise checklists are complete, I set the destination airport elevation into the altitude box of the airport in the flight plan as an at-crossing constraint. I do this before even thinking about what approach I might have. If I have an arrival in the clearance, this typically isn't necessary, of course. Once this is set, I get a reasonable TOD and a time remaining to TOD. Once I'm close enough to have an idea of my approach plan, I can load the approach, and typically the TOD for the approach is close enough to what it had calculated before if I haven't already started my descent." And I think Chuck's point is that if you look at the TOD to the airport before you add an approach, you'll see whether adding the approach screwed up the TOD. And here's one other trick that would have solved my problem at Bakersfield. There's a soft key that can help you see if your TOD has been calculated correctly, and I don't think I've ever used it in flight, but I will in the future. In Garmin glass cockpits, there's a soft key labeled VNV Direct, where direct is indicated by the letter D with an arrow through it, and it's the same symbol you see on the Direct 2 key. You can use the key at any time to see what descent rate is required to get down to the altitude for any waypoint in your flight plan. In my Max Trust Guides G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, I wrote, "Once you've entered all of the altitude constraints in a flight plan, you can easily reference any of these altitudes for a descent without affecting lateral guidance to any intermediate waypoints in the flight plan." Which is to say that you can still follow all of the twists and turns in your flight plan while still creating an immediate descent to any altitude in your flight plan and bypassing any earlier altitude constraints in the flight plan. Continuing on, from the MFD's Active Flight Plan page, press the VNV Direct 2 soft key to initiate vertical descent guidance. This opens a new window asking if you'd like to activate descent guidance. If you didn't highlight a waypoint, the window chooses the next valid altitude shown in light blue text in the flight plan. Alternatively, if you highlighted a subsequent waypoint or altitude prior to pushing the VNV Direct 2 soft key, that altitude is referenced. Pressing the Enter key confirms activation and immediately activates descent guidance. So in the Bakersfield example, if I'd been flying a G1000 or Perspective Glass cockpit, and I'd put the cursor on the airport identifier and press the VNV Direct 2 soft key, it would have shown me exactly what descent rate was required if I were to descend immediately. If, for example, it said 200 feet per minute required, I'd know it was too soon to start descending. On the other hand, if it said 800 feet per minute and I felt that was a good descent rate, I'd just have to push the VNV key on the autopilot, and I could then start descending along the twists and turns in my route, knowing I had started my descent in time to arrive at the airport at whatever altitude I entered for the airport. Any intermediate altitudes in my flight plan would be skipped over, and new altitudes would be recalculated for those intermediate waypoints to allow me to reach the target altitude for the airport. Now here's another use for the VNV Direct 2 soft key. Imagine that you're flying IFR and that you've been cleared to descend via on an arrival. When you load the arrival, the crossing altitudes for each waypoint in the arrival will be listed in the flight plan. But suppose during the descent, you were subsequently instructed to level off before reaching the bottom altitude on the arrival. And then later, you were cleared to the bottom altitude for the arrival, but not as a descend via instruction, meaning you could now go directly to the bottom altitude without meeting any of the remaining crossing altitudes. In that case, you could put the cursor on the waypoint for the bottom altitude, push the VNV Direct 2 soft key, and then the VNV key on the autopilot, and dial the altitude select knob down to the bottom altitude. New altitudes would then be recalculated for all of the arrival waypoints, and they most likely be different from those original crossing altitudes, and you would arrive at the bottom altitude without having to meet the crossing restrictions that would have applied if you'd been told to descend via for the rest of the arrival. Well, I hope this has given you a few new ideas and tools for planning the vertical navigation portion of your future flights. And just a quick note, I know it's been 2 weeks since I got the last show out, and that was mainly because I've been flying almost nonstop. And this coming weekend, well, looks more like the same. Flying again on my days off. So just doing what we can to help people meet their objectives. So I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll get the next one out as soon as we can. In the meantime, please tell other people about the show. Consider signing up yourself via Patreon or via PayPal. Or send us your feedback or listener question by going to aviationnewstalk.com and clicking Contact at the top of the page. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.